Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros, Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies. I'm very, very excited to welcome you to today's webinar that looks at one of my favorite issues, the nexus between China and Latin America. In early January of 2026, as many of you may recall, the U.S. launched a strike in Venezuela that captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. In response, the UN Security Council convened a meeting to discuss the intervention at the request of China, Colombia, and Russia. There was an enormous amount of condemnation of the U.S. action. There was praise for it as well. And today, what we want to look at is, we think, one of the more understudied dimensions of the bold U.S. action in Venezuela, which is Chinese perceptions of it, Chinese reactions of it, and what it means for China's relationship with Latin America and Latin America's relationship with China. Today's event is co-sponsored by, of course, Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and the Georgetown Americas Institute. We have three fantastic speakers, some of whom are, I'm sure, very, very well known to listeners today. In alphabetical order, we have Professor Guo Jie, Associate Professor at the School of International Studies at Peking University, Beida. Her research focuses on Latin American politics and diplomacy, China-Latin America relations, as well as comparative politics. Second, we have Leland Lazarus, the founder and CEO of Lazarus Consulting LLC, who has been working on China-Latin America issues for a very, very long time. And I'm constantly jealous of his ability to switch between Mandarin and Spanish. I wish I was as fluent in both. And then last but not least, we have Oliver Stunkel, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace here in Washington, D.C., who is also a non-resident fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a professor of international relations at FGV in Sao Paulo. His research focuses on geopolitics and global order, Brazilian foreign policy, Latin America politics, and emerging powers. Here's what I'd like to do today. Here's sort of the rundown of what we're going to start with. First, we're going to start with Guo Jie, to discuss China's interpretation of U.S. actions in Venezuela, and what it means for China's relationship with the region. Next, we're going to go to Oliver to look at how Latin American countries perceived and reacted to the U.S. action in Venezuela. And then we're going to turn to Leland to sort of bring the two sides of the equation together. And then, of course, this is going to be a conversation among all of us to try and better understand what the future direction of China-Latin America-China relations looks like. And then we're going to end with about 20 minutes of Q&A. So with that, I'd like to first turn it over to Guo Jie to help us understand how did China look at and interpret the events of early January. Guo?
Okay, good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers for this kind invitation. Today is also the first day of Chinese Lunar New Year, so let me take this opportunity to wish you all a prosperous year of the horse. Before the event, and also just like our moderator just mentioned, there's some guiding questions for me, and I will try to take them one by one. And before I begin, let me just clarify that all the views I expressed today are entirely my own. First question about is how did China initially view the removal of Maduro? We know that on January 3rd, the United States launched a military operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. I would say that China's immediate reaction was not fundamentally different from that of many other countries and international organizations. On the one hand, the possibility of U.S. intervention was not entirely unexpected. We know that since last August, Washington had been increasing its military presence in the Caribbean. And since 2019, then US President Trump, as well as some senior US officials, such as John Bolton, have repeatedly emphasized that all options are on the table and that Monroe Doctrine is not obsolete. So, in that sense, the risk had long been signaled. On the other hand, the way this intervention was carried out, physically removing the sitting leader of a sovereign state from his own territory, was deeply shocking. Yes, there are similar cases in history in this hemisphere, but to say something like this happens in 21st century is still striking. The subsequent press conference in which President Trump said that United States would wrong Venezuela and its oil, further intensify international concerns. From China's perspective, U.S. military operation presents a clear violation of the UN Charter and principle of the state sovereignty. And in that sense, China's reaction reflects a broader international concern about erosion of the established norms and sovereign equality. Now, the second question, what does this mean for China-Venezuela relations? Well, I see this in two ways. First, what we have seen so far is a leadership change, not a structural regime transformation. So the vice president has assumed the role of acting president, and the broader political configuration has not fundamentally shifted. So at this stage, there's no clear evidence that China-Venezuela relationship have been fundamentally altered. Second, even if Venezuela's political landscape were to change more significantly in the future, that would not necessarily mean a breakdown in relationship with China. Political change is very common in Latin America and also everywhere. And governments come and go, ideological orientations shift. But China's relations across the region have generally proved quite resilient. We have seen this in many countries, including some close partners in this region, such as Brazil and now Argentina, for instance. A change in government does not automatically redefine the broader framework of engagement with China. So China's foreign policy is grounded in non-interference. It has experience working with governments of very different political orientations. If we step back and look at a longer trajectory, China-Venezuela relations grow very quickly in the especially the first decade of 21st century. Alongside the broader expansion of China's ties with Latin America. This was closely tied to China's entry into WTO and the global commodities boom at the same time. But after 2014, especially with the collapse of oil prices, Venezuela into a severe economic crisis. By 2017 and to 2020, the situation in that country had become particularly acute. During those years, China's economic presence, like that of many other foreign partners, declined significantly in that country. Trade dropped, investment slowed, and many Chinese companies actually pulled out. Over the past few years, however, Venezuela's economy has gradually begun to stabilize. When I was there for my field research last August, so the situation was actually better than I had expected. The economy of Venezuela has been heavily dollarized in the past few years. Inflation is still there, but it's far slower than during the worst years of the crisis. Domestic production has partially recovered, and goods are much more available in the market. That said, severe or serious challenges remain. For instance, I can say that people still, cannot enjoy very, reasonable wages, especially compared to the high prices in the market, and persistent inequality is still there. At the same time, the investment environment is still quite constrained, both because of domestic structural weaknesses and because of the external sanctions, especially from the United States. It is not yet an environment that strongly attracted large-scale foreign investment. For that reason, the recent U.S. operation may not have as dramatic an economic impact on foreign investors, including Chinese companies, as some commentaries suggested. So, in fact, foreign business activity in Venezuela has already been relatively limited in recent years or in the past decade. Even US oil companies have been fairly cautious about returning to that country after US operation. So some of the claims that China's economic interests will suffer severe damage may be overstating how much Chinese companies are actually exposed at this point in that country. Part of the problem is the information gap that has existed since 2019. There's a noticeable gap between how the situation is described and externally and what is actually happening on the ground. And that was also one of my strongest impressions when I was there last year. Now let me attend to the third question. What lessons might China draw from all this? I have to say, this is probably the most difficult question for me. International politics always involves risks that go beyond what we can reasonably predict. Very few analysts could have foreseen that in the 21st century, we would witness something reminiscent of the Panama episode, especially involving a country of Venezuela's size and geopolitical importance. And this raises a broad concern. If similar actions were to take place elsewhere, even in closest US allies such as Colombia, or hypothetically in a much larger country like Mexico, how could we anticipate that? How would we prevent it? So when established norms begin to weaken, it becomes much harder to rely on stable, predictive framework. The usual assumption no longer feel quite as solid. So perhaps the lesson here is not just about Venezuela. It's about changing nature of geopolitical risk itself. When big powers' behavior becomes less predictable, when it moves beyond conventional cost-benefit logic, the operating environment for all external actors, including China, becomes more uncertain. Now let me close with one broader observation. U.S. concern about China's relationship with Latin American countries, including China, Venezuelan ties, is not something new. That has been building for some time. But as the strategic importance of the Western Hemisphere increases, and as Washington's posture becomes more assertive, that concern is now transforming or translating into more structural policy constraints. This will inevitably shape the external environment in which China Latin America cooperation takes place. But it is important to separate two things: the geopolitical environment on one hand, and the underlying logic of cooperation on the other. Latin American countries continue to have strong demand for investment, technology, infrastructure, and industrial partnership. No single external power in this world can actually meet all of those needs. So China's presence in the region is rooted in economic complementarity and development demand. External pressures may intensify, but the structural drivers of engagement of both sides are unlikely to disappear. So, what is changing is the geopolitical context. What is not changing, at least fundamentally, is the logic of China Latin America cooperation. So, that's my view, my views, personal views on all those three questions. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Guojie. That was wonderful, very thoughtful, very well structured, very strategic. I have a few follow-up questions before we invite Oliver to talk about Latin American reactions. So, I guess my first question is, did Beijing say or do anything in particular in reaction to the US invasion in terms of like practical, actual actions on the part of Beijing?
Oh, well, you can say, there's some formal declaration from and also from our press conference of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They criticized this operation. And okay, I think beyond that, there's no actual or special message to like,
Sure.
to how to say assert to how to say to assert our relationship with Venezuela or any special signals from Beijing.
Okay. That's interesting. So a question that often gets asked in Washington that I'd really love your perspective on is this issue of how to accurately characterize China's interest in Venezuela. Are they principally economic interests, or is there a sort of political security or even a strategic interest there? How would you characterize China's interest in Venezuela? And of course, have the recent events, the fall of Maduro as a person, but not the regime, has that changed that calculation for Beijing?
I think we have this relationships. I mean, this close relationship since how to say since the early 21st century, and it's not changed at all. I mean, some countries like United States, have some different policies to that country, especially after 2019. This interference of domestic, election and election results, something like this. But China still, stick to the principle of non-interference. So we have this, this non-stop relationship with the Maduro administration. And in terms of the strategic, I don't think so. And this is something, like we have a relationship with other Latin American countries. Well, a lot of observations mention that we have this, like energy concerns or oil importation from Venezuela.
Hmm.
But everyone knows that the production capacity in that country is very low now. So, you know, uh, the whole volume we now imported from Venezuela accounting for only very minimal, a percentage of our imported oil from the whole world. So it's almost, it's almost nothing or very minimal. And also, as I mentioned, the Chinese companies, especially oil companies, they actually left for some years. And other companies like construction companies and other, infrastructure, operations, kind of suspended. So the Chinese companies, or especially economic presence in that country, is not that big. It's not that big. But
Right.
politically or diplomatically, we still the same thing. We have this relationship, keep this relationship, and we have no extra how to say like episodes taking place in our bilateral
Mhm.
relationship. So this is a normal relationship. But China is also, important, international, how to say, kind of an international uh, 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 actor in this global arena. So we have this obligation to say, to how to say, to uh, safeguard this UN Charter or this international role
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
an international, big power. So that's the
Sure.
obligation side of our role. I think
So let
I
me
think
ask you,
that
so it's very clear that China has substantial economic interests, but as you point out, it's less about actual presence in Venezuela or infrastructure. So a big question that's out there is, you know, China lent Venezuela hundreds of billions of dollars. That debt is there. Venezuela was paying off that debt by transferring oil to China. The US now controls that oil. So, uh, how should we think about what China's existing economic interest is in Venezuela? And do you think the US, sorry, do you think China is asking the US, hey, like, how are we going to get paid back now? How should we think about that question?
well, the lending thing. I mean, this is something I I I have a long been thinking of that. It's like why everybody mentioned this because we know we don't know this figure. It's like a lot of people mention that China, uh, kind of especially our CDB,
Mhm.
lend uh, have lend that country a lot of money, but we don't know this figure. And I know all the media and
But we
all
know
the
it's not a
people are
small figure.
citing. But we don't know the figure. It's like everybody citing the number from the database from Inter-American Dialogue and Boston University. They have that database about Chinese financing to Latin America. But from China, we don't have this figure at all. So I have no um, if I don't have this very solid evidence. I have no
Mhm.
I cannot say anything about that. And especially people are mentioning that we still have some, like Venezuela still have a lot of money and not paying back to China. Still, this is something like a secret or not a it's like a story. So we don't know how much of this remaining amount of this loan and whether there's a still, you know. So
Oh, so it's possible that
left.
Venezuela has paid back China already?
We don't know, especially I don't know.
Uh-huh.
So I've always tried to avoid answering this question.
Right. I mean, I'm not trying to ask a sensitive question. I'm trying to understand what does the dynamic look like among Venezuela, the US, and China? Because, in other words, the US now controls the principal mechanism through which Venezuela was paying back China. So the question is, when Xi Jinping and Trump sit down in Beijing in April, is one of the items on Xi Jinping's list, hey, we want our share of, Venezuelan oil, or we want to get paid back. That's the I understand you can't answer it, but that's the issue that I'm getting at, as how is Venezuela, the US action in Venezuela influencing the US China dynamic?
Well, what I got from the press conference after the operation is that US President say nothing about China on that, right? And I think some question raised at the conference, at the press conference about China's role and try to say something, try to get some information from the US president. But I remember clearly he said nothing about China's involvement, in this operation.
Right.
And he said a lot about oil and about other things like
Sure,
we were
sure.
wrong
Well,
and
of
said
course.
nothing about China's, factor. So that's something also surprised me. And because I also envisioned there's something related to China's relationship with, this competition between China and United States or any consideration about China's
Hmm.
role.
Yeah.
But according to the information that the President Trump give us, almost nothing related to that. So that's
Of course,
something.
other people like Secretary of State Rubio did reference China in talking about Venezuela. So I think that even if Trump didn't talk about it, that it's part of the U.S. calculation. But I want to invite Oliver to come into this conversation, tell us a little bit about how Latin American countries reacted to the U.S. action and how that might influence their relationship with Beijing. Oliver?
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, Evan. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join this debate with Guo and Leland. I think uh, that first of all, it's important to point out how this has been a watershed moment. I know that in Washington, people talk about Latin America a lot, whereas it's not really a strategic space. The scene from Brazil, what happens in the Caribbean or Mexico is not that relevant. I think there's a profound division between South America and Central America, Mexico, and so Caribbean. And this is the first time in history that an overt U.S. military action toppled a sitting leader in South America. There have been covert operations in the past, but I think it's sometimes underestimated in Washington how significant this has been and how impactful the images of Delta forces descending on a presidential palace in South America look like from Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. So this is a transformative moment for the way that governments in the region think about their national security, irrespective of the Maduro regime. The
You mean,
reaction,
Oliver, because they worry about that action against them?
yes, this is a precedent, and this is a precedent. Now,
Mhm.
you could say, of course, Maduro is very unique, and that's probably true. But when you look at the justifications, and we've just talked about that, it was initially about drugs. Venezuela is not a key player in drug trafficking. There's other countries much more important. So others, per definition, have to worry. Then about China, there's other countries that have a much broader economic relationship. There's much more, let's say, trade between Brazil and China is much more significant. So Brazil would have to worry. Then it was about um, uh, occasionally democracy, but that was sort of a side issue. That was about oil. Brazil has 20% of the world's critical minerals. So what's interesting is that you have, I would say in general, a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because nobody liked Maduro. Everybody paid the price, both in terms of having a very unstable neighbor who was exporting instability, there were refugee populations, but also because it sort of affected negatively the brand of South America, right? I mean, this was a sort of basket case. And when I talk to investors, it's not good to have a country like that in your neighborhood, just for the way that other countries see the region. There was, I think, a bit of a divergence. Let's say if you talk to the elites, they talked about international law and say this is very concerning. Now, if you talk to a cab driver in Buenos Aires or São Paulo, most of them would probably say, finally somebody got this guy out. So it's actually quite interesting that when you look at public opinion, it wasn't really that critical. There's a bit of a divergence there. And public reaction by policymakers largely tracked ideology. So you had the castes and the Malays, and obviously saying, so glad Trump finally took care of this. Whereas Boric and Lula were like, this is a very worrisome precedent. But and that has to do also with the fact that, but even Lula and Boric didn't really lash out at Trump because Lula just managed to somehow normalize relations. He's on his way to Washington later this month. So right now, nobody wants to antagonize Trump publicly so much. But behind the scenes, if you talk to military planners, even in countries where presidents celebrated that, a lot of people are saying this has very profound long-term implications for the way we do procurement, for the way we think about our digital sovereignty. And a phrase I've heard from leading military officials in several countries was, we realized how vulnerable we are. The United States can practically push a button and our fighter jets do not take off any longer, right? I mean, it was let's say, the formidable power of how this was carried out. Obviously, there were some people inside the palace who passed information to the US military, but you literally had the lights go off in military bases around Venezuela prior to this. So this is an overwhelming show of force. And, there's debates in Brazil, again, behind closed doors right now, but very concrete about diversification of, military technology, about the fact that it's maybe a problem that all our healthcare data is stored in a cloud in Virginia and things like that. This has been happening before, so hedging is not a new strategy, of course, in South America, but it has certainly been accelerated by the events of January 3rd. And I think that in the medium long term, south of Venezuela, January 3rd is great news for China. It is great news for China because there's an evident consensual perception that depending excessively on the United States is just dangerous. Nobody wants to be Mexico, Panama, or Canada right now. And it's obvious that last year, Lula was able to stand up to Trump when the United States imposed sanctions on our Supreme Court in order to influence the prosecution of a former president who had attempted to stage a coup, thanks to trade with China, because Brazil exports more to China than to Europe and the United States combined. So this is evident. Now, of course, diversification will not only be about China. China will be a beneficiary of it, but it's also about, who will benefit are the Europeans if they ever get to act together, the Indians, the Indonesians. So there's a lot of that. If you just look at the trajectory of Lula's travel, it's to India this weekend, where Brazil is very keen to cooperate on critical minerals. They want to cooperate on critical minerals with the Chinese, with the Europeans. They did not join the Critical Mineral Alliance with the United States, precisely because the perception was that it implied some expectation of exclusivity with the United States, which, given that scenario of the Donroe Doctrine, is seen as a national security risk. So I think that the story is very different in Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, where the Donroe Doctrine will, I would expect, dramatically reduce Chinese influence. We see that in Panama, where the Supreme Court was pressured to kick out the Chinese port operator. I think the leeway that Mexico has is very small. I think the same, by the way, for Canada is going to be very difficult, even though everybody celebrates Mark Carney. South America has much more leeway, and I don't expect the Peruvians to fold as easily now that the United States is putting pressure on them to kick out the Chinese from Shanghai, as the Panamanians did. Just a brief...
Oliver, can I just come in on that quickly? Because it's such an important point. Your distinction between South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, obviously essential to understanding this dynamic. But let's take South America. So if we look at Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Peru, I mean, you have very right-leaning pro-Trump governments in Milei in Argentina, soon to be cast in Chile. So might we see sort of a split in South America where Brazil and Peru sort of resist the Donroe Doctrine and keep China in play as a way to hedge U.S. risk, and you have Argentina and Chile sort of lean into the Donroe Doctrine? Help me think about how the politics of the region overlay the strategy questions.
So there is an event in Miami, I think on March 7th, where Trump is meeting with ideological allies, so to say, in order to specifically discuss how to reduce, among other things, how to reduce Chinese influence. I think that there you're going to have a divergence between, let's say, publicly ingratiating yourself with Trump and what's actually happening on the ground. I think Bolsonaro, when he was in power, was a great example. He was very much pro-Trump in rhetoric. He actually actively sought to identify issues to strengthen Brazil-U.S. ties. Brazil became a major non-NATO ally, which has some marginal benefits for military cooperation and so on. But trade between Brazil and China grew during Bolsonaro's time in office. And I would think that the most likely scenario is that there will be on the surface a lot of rhetoric, or that's at least the plan of the likes of Chile or Argentina, to say, we love you, Trump, but we can't actually reduce our trade with China because we've got all sorts of very immediate challenges that we're facing on the ground. And I think the resistance by, let's say, the Argentine electorate vis-a-vis actively reducing ties to China would be significant. And in many cases, it's the agribusiness, which is quite conservative. So this is key part of the base of, let's say, Milei, that he can't. I mean, I think it would be difficult and to actually do that. So that's good. So I think that you will have, on the public rhetoric side, a clear division between right-wing governments and left-wing governments. But it's also important to point out that the key dynamic in Latin America is a pendulum, right? So even if Milei were to sort of, again, I don't expect him to do that, would like raise or to downgrade business ties or seek to create obstacles for trade with China. As Guo said, I mean, these are market forces which are very difficult to undo. So I would then expect that the next electoral cycle, when we have a new pink tide, that swing back. I think it's a very dangerous strategy by the US government to focus on ideological alignment, because that inevitably creates an unstable bilateral relationship, whereas China sort of works with pretty much anyone, right? So I think that's
But Oliver, aren't we sort of past that when it comes to Brazil? I mean, the antipathy between Trump and Lula it's not really hidden.
It's not hidden, but now ties are fine. I mean, you also had the famous hug in New York prior to the UN General Assembly. I expect the bilateral meeting in Washington to go well, actually, and it's sort of unclear.
And remind us, when is that, Oliver?
The meeting, so that will be either in late February or first half of March.
So it's coming.
So Lula is coming to the White House, and at least the hope in Brazil is, and I think there's some evidence for that, is that the meeting will go somewhat similarly to the one between Trump and Petro. So it's not only ideology; it's a bit unclear, sort of. And I mean, Lula will seek to stabilize that relationship. Now, I think you still may have pro-Trump forces seeking to intervene in the elections in November, as the United States did in Honduras and in Argentina, and I think quite successfully so. I just want to make one final point. I think we're obviously talking about the immediate sort of actions and what that means, but I think it's also important to talk about, or to briefly at least mention, how Venezuela will play out, and that will have a huge impact on how the region relates to both the United States and China. Now, there is a scenario in which Venezuela stabilizes economically and politically, it will transition towards a democracy. I personally am very skeptical about that, because I think Trump would be skeptical vis-a-vis democratization, because the way he talks about the Venezuelan oil sows the seeds of a future Chavez, who basically runs for office and says, they're taking our oil, we want it back. So basically have a nationalization of Venezuelan oil 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So political opening could happen, but not necessarily driven by the United States. And the math that the United States wants to take a part of the oil, but still grow the pie so it benefits the Venezuelan people, I think is definitely a long shot. Expectations are crazy. You talk to business people right now on the ground, or business lawyers in Caracas, they get lots of calls. I would probably think that the medium-term scenario is probably a continuation of the status quo. That will not only drive discontent vis-a-vis Delcy Rodriguez, but also vis-a-vis Trump, because Venezuela is not a sovereign nation at this stage. I mean, she's in power thanks to Trump. She needs to report to Trump, and I think people will understand that. So if Venezuela doesn't turn out well, I think that this is certainly does have the potential to be seen as kind of an occupation that is not helping the Venezuelan people. And nationalism and self-determination, I think, are very potent forces. So at some point, I think there is a political opening for a second anti-American nationalism as a response to that. Again, not for sure, because right now there's still optimism on the ground, but we've also seen that after military interventions in the past. So if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 months after intervention, or even Libya, you had a lot of optimism, and then sort of things did not work out that well.
And 1 second, Oliver, on Cuba.
I think that that may be one of the narratives that the United States uses if Cuba were to initiate some kind of transition, be it economically or democratically, that even though Venezuela a couple of years down the line doesn't turn out that well, that was sort of a necessary step to liberate Cuba. And I think that has, particularly for Rubio's presidential ambitions, a lot of value. And just like with Venezuela, I think very few governments in the region are willing to die on that hill in the support of the Cuban people. I think Steinbaum under a lot of pressure to stop exporting oil. And then I think there's a high likelihood of having significant political change, be it in the Venezuela type model or something more profound. And just a final phrase, which I thought was interesting by an esteemed Venezuelan friend who said that the chances of democratization in Cuba are possibly bigger than those in Venezuela, because you don't have the whole trouble of the armed forces very politically and economically involved, kind of a clean slate, even though you don't have a political opposition, potentially a less complicated case than Venezuela.
Interesting. So Leland, you've been very, very patient. But I want to bring you in to basically bridge the two sides of this conversation. So we've talked about the Chinese perceptions, Chinese reaction. Oliver led us through Latin American reactions. Sort of bring these two parts of the conversation together. Where do you see China's relationship with Latin America and specifically Venezuela headed? You've been studying this longer than most. You pointed out in an earlier conversation we had that like a week after the national security strategy was adopted, the Chinese dropped a new Latin America white paper. Undoubtedly, you've read it in English, Chinese, and Spanish. So just sort of walk us through China's approach to Venezuela and Latin America, and then flip the script Latin America relationship with China.
Absolutely. And Evan, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's an honor, Guojie, it's an honor, Oliver, to do this with you. Before I get into that, I just want to foot stomp some of the things that both have said. First, Oliver, I agree with you 100% about this idea that the political pendulum swings in the region. And while it may look to the Trump administration right now that it's having a lot of wins, I think that ultimately they're going to be Pyrrhic victories. Because when you so blatantly bring up the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, right? We know, I mean, I'm a gringo, but my family comes from Panama, right? So when they hear Monroe Doctrine, when people in the region hear Monroe Doctrine, it brings up the old ghosts of U.S. imperialism across the political spectrum in the region. And so to the extent that continues to be the modus operandi of this administration, it's definitely going to cause some long-term negative viewpoints over the long term. I wanted to also bring up a story which colleagues of ours, Margaret Myers of Inter-American Dialogue, reminded me a few weeks ago. of the comparison between, say, Venezuela and Cuba, which is Chen Yuan. He was the former governor of the China Development Bank, and all the way back in the early 2000s, he met with Fidel Castro in Cuba. And it was actually, at least they say it, right? This story could be apocryphal, but maybe not. But they say that it was Fidel Castro who said to Chen Yuan, "Hey, have you thought of investing in Venezuela?" And that there's this great charismatic leader there named Hugo Chavez, and I think there's a lot of potential economic benefit that China could gain from there. So you can say that it's basically from that trip to Cuba that then China ultimately increased its expansion into Venezuela. And I think it really typifies the development of China's engagement in the region over the past 2 decades. Um, there have, of course, been some other Chinese scholars who've described the early engagement of China in the region as going with the flow, that it was essentially opportunistic, that of course after you know uh, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the going out strategy, trying to get more Chinese state-owned enterprises and private companies to find markets abroad. That was, of course, juiced even more after the 2008 financial crisis, where, of course, a lot of Western countries and companies were in financial straits. And so Chinese companies were able to kind of fill the void that was left by Western companies. But I would argue that certainly over the past decade, that purely economic interests have expanded well beyond just the economic to include the political and, more importantly, the security. Um, I think this is best described in what you mentioned, Evan, the China CELAC Joint Action Plan that was announced in May of last year, and then the follow-on, the white paper that the Chinese published just a couple weeks after our national security strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean, and they focus on these five strategic pillars, right? The solidarity pillar, which is political, in which they want to send 300 local politicians from Latin America and the Caribbean to China every year over the next 3 years, right? So that's 900 in total, 300 every year, 900 in total. The development pillar, of course, trying to extend the $9 billion credit line for development in the region and establishing a natural disaster response center in the Caribbean. The third is the peace pillar, which is under the Global Security Initiative, where they want to expand law enforcement engagement, and they want to do more research around space and the Antarctic. And then the cultural and people-to-people pillars are basically under the Global Civilization Initiative, so more people-to-people ties, more getting more students to study Mandarin, and so on and so forth. And so I think that in many ways, Venezuela is a microcosm of what we've seen, which is the expansion of Chinese interests well beyond economics. Of course, Guojie had mentioned the obviously the oil. And by the way, you made a great point, Guojie, that the number in terms of how much China has loaned to Venezuela, there's a huge swing, right? I mean, Inter-American Dialogue says 60 billion, Aid Data says 106 billion. What is the truth there, right? And of course, the devil's in the details, the devil's in the sort of the difference in methodology and whatnot. But I think it's a really great point on there really is no consensus, true consensus on how much Venezuela owes to China. But in addition to the oil, Oliver, you mentioned the 20% critical minerals that are in Venezuela. This was corroborated by Maria Corina Machado herself at a America Business Forum event right here in Miami in November of last year, where she said that back in 2012, Hugo Chavez contracted CITIC, right? Zhongxin, the bank slash multinational Chinese corporation, in order to do a comprehensive study of all the critical minerals that exist in Venezuelan territory. And she stressed that to this day, CITIC is the only company in the world that has that survey, which of course gives it a strategic leverage, going forward. So there's a critical mineral aspect. But there's also the surveillance technology aspect, right? ZTE, for example, helped the Maduro regime establish the Carnet de la Patria, right? The fatherland cards, of which, you know, the reporting has said that the regime had used that in order to reward political sycophants and to punish political dissidents by not giving them food or cutting off their internet and things like that using this fatherland card system. Um, and then you have space, right? Chinese companies have built two satellite ground stations in El Sobrero and El Luepa. And this may be seen as nothing more than just space research facilities, but there is, of course, concern, certainly from my clients, from the U.S. Department of War, that these kinds of space facilities are also satellite tracking systems, right? And in the same way they can use the frequencies to track and receive information from their own satellites, Chinese satellites, they could essentially use the same thing in order to intercept information, gather information from competitor satellites like the US and other countries. So it's a real concern. The mill to mill relationship has also flourished in the past decade, where Venezuela has purchased light tanks and rocket launchers and anti-ship and anti-tank missiles. They had set up the JY-27A anti-missile system, which of course failed on January 3rd. But all of this to say that the relationship that China has with not just Venezuela, but also the region has expanded well beyond economics, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
So, Leland, you would say that China very much does have a broader interest in Venezuela than simply economics.
Yes. And
And
I know that there's a debate around the importance of the whole region for China, right? There's some who've written that, well, when you look at it, there's only been, over the past several years, 17 visits by Chinese high-ranking officials to the region, and mostly during the sidelines of, other international summits like APEC or, G20 or whatnot. And you compare that to, more than 70 or 70 something in Asia, 70 something in Africa. Um, but that also doesn't take into account the steady march of the Chinese private sector in the region, right? Where
interesting.
you
Yeah.
where you do see, BYD and Great Wall and G-Tour and NIO everywhere throughout the region, certainly on the streets of Brazil, Mexico, my second homeland, Panama. And so I do think that of course, the region is a key market, certainly for the Chinese private sector, and will continue to be in this near future.
Interesting. So, Leland, would you say that when China looks at Latin America, it's principally a source of natural resources and a source of demand, a place that can absorb Chinese exports? Is that sort of the primary interest on the part of the Chinese?
That is a primary interest, but I want to stress the space aspect because um,
You mean
in
outer
order
space?
outer space, that's right, outer space.
Okay.
So the way that smarter people have described it to me, right? Because I'm certainly no space research expert, but what I understand is that every country, both U.S., EU, other space power, India is another, they need to have satellite ground stations positioned throughout the world in order to really have a holistic view of their space domain awareness, right?
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
they do not have a satellite ground station in, say, another hemisphere on the opposite side of the world, then when their satellites are passing through, it lags, right? It takes time then to download certain information, whether you're a space researcher or a military planner, to gather that information that the satellite had gathered when it was passing through, right? So why do I mention this? Because there are at least 11 um, space sites, ground station sites throughout Latin America and the
Hmm.
Caribbean that have been.
Which Latin American countries do we know? Is that something that's publicly available?
It is publicly available. I think for example, CSIS, they've done some really good open source research to kind of capture this. Some other research institutions have done the same, but Argentina, right? Everybody, the case study everybody knows about is Neuquén in Argentina. Was built by basically a subsidiary of the People's Liberation Army, a subset of it. And the terms of the agreement that was signed in 2017, this was under Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, was that it was essentially more or less sovereign territory, right, on the part of the Chinese, and that Argentine researchers could only use it for 10% of the time. And that's caused a lot of concern around the true nature of what that ground satellite station is really being used for. And so Neocan is just one. There was one that was potentially going to be built in Cerro Pentarones in Chile, and that has been postponed and stopped. There was another one that was going to be built in
Hmm.
Argentina, the China Argentine radio telescope, and that has been postponed. There are two others in Bolivia, some in Brazil as well. They're building. It's called the Bingo project. That when it's built, it's going to be one of the largest radio telescopes in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's a joint project between Chinese researchers and Brazilian researchers. Um, so all this to say that from a space domain awareness aspect, the region is actually quite important for China, and you're seeing this increased march in trying to find opportunities to expand space research facilities and opportunities on the part of Chinese companies.
Interesting. Oliver, is this something that you know about or want to come in on? This is a really interesting dimension of China-Latin America relations I hadn't really focused on.
So my sense is that you do have on the side of space tech a lot of cooperation and potential cooperation and projects going on with China, less so on overtly military technology, which I think is seen as perhaps unnecessarily provocative. When I sort of talk to people who work on these issues, particularly excluding Venezuela, where I think is a bit of a different case. I think that there is significant, or there's a perception that cooperation with China uh, is more significant than that with the United States, and where in areas which are much broader than what we just discussed, going from electric vehicles to space cooperation to satellites to 5G, 6G to all of that. That there you have sort of a greater potential when it comes to cooperation with China. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, we have a whole slew of questions queuing up. So for those of you that are watching and listening, please feel free to submit questions using the QA function. We're making a big long list here, and I'm going to start going through these questions. The first question I'm going to hand over to Guo Jie. It's a question about the new China, the new Latin America white paper that China issued, I believe, in December. Why did China issue that paper at that particular time? and what is new and interesting in the white paper? Guojie?
Okay, thanks for the question. And personally, I think we should have a new version of the white paper much earlier because the last version,
When
we
was,
released.
I don't know the history. When was the
The
prior one?
first one we released in 2008, and the second version in 2016. So it's almost it's almost almost 10
Every
years
8 years?
already. Not every, but I think lot of a lot of changes taking place. So we need to update it according to new developments. So for me, it's something finally arrived. So and if you look at this white paper, I think it become how to say it contains a lot of details now, and also some format are changing. Last time, if
Hmm.
you compare a little bit with the first version and the second version, the first version is like a general principle, it's like very, something very concise one. And now then the second version, add more, notions and declarations of our, high leadership. They raise some, some notions, not just for Latin America, but also containing Latin America. So we add all those things into the second version. And in the last few years and or last almost decades, a lot of changes, and also our high leadership also propose some new ideas about also the like the world development or some new ideas of the Chinese foreign engagement with the whole world. So we have all those new things put into this third version, and but also we also added something from our like select China Select Forum. We have these documents, we also cited some elements from these documents which representing some consensus we have got with our not all 33 countries in the region, but not all coming here or gathering together for the summit. But anyway, we have some new elements also from that document. So this one also, I think also got some inspiration from our white paper with Africa, because we had the first one with Africa in 2006, and we had the the white paper with Latin America. So you can, if you compare a little bit to the first version, there's some similarities, and we have much how to say it's like a kind of a much closer relationship with Africa. And if you look at the our white paper to Africa, the paper has more details and more big version. So there are a lot of changes, but still, I think the main idea is still the same. We emphasize a lot about this, this development issue and this, consensus and equality. So a lot of
Sure.
ideas still keeping the same way uh, uh, in the in the three versions.
Guoche, can I ask you, the new China Latin America white paper came out a week after the Trump administration's national security strategy and the articulation of the Don Roe doctrine. So it gave Americans or analysts in the US the impression that there's sort of a little bit of a sense of competition, like the Americans are asserting their presence and strategic interests in Latin America, and then suddenly a week later, the new Chinese Latin America white paper drops. Was that intentional? How should we interpret the timing? And then Leland, I'm going to get your impression of the new China Latin America white paper. Would you?
I think this is maybe this is just a coincidence, we prepare a white paper not just to, it's a long-term thing. So a lot of experts and also diplomats
Sure.
involved in this whole process. So it must take a long time. And in terms of the timing, I have no idea. This is something, from above. But anyway, I think if you look at the paper itself, uh, I personally, I didn't see anything, you know, uh, very closely related to the national security strategy of United States. So, so
Yeah.
that's my, my feeling at that time.
Leland?
Yeah, I would agree with Guojie. Um, I think when you compare the white paper released in December and then the China CELAC Joint Action Plan, right, 2025, 2026, 2027, that was released several months before in May, there really isn't much daylight between the two. So the white paper is essentially a regurgitation of what was already written back in May, in which it stresses, again, the five pillar strategy that China is going to have for the region over the next 3 years, the solidarity, development, peace, civilization, and people to people. I agree 100% with Guojie that in many ways, China's approach to this region is similar to China's approach to Africa, whether it be mm,
Hmm.
using FOCAC and CELAC, right, as multilateral mechanisms in order to move forward the China's relationship with both regions, or as you mentioned, Guojie, even using the same format. Because if you look at the China FOCAC joint action plan over the next 3 years, they have a 10 pillar strategy, and they're very, very specific on what their goals are. And I think that they essentially use that same structure, the five pillar strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean. But I mean, I think for folks who are true China Latin America watchers, I know that some people tend to discount um, Chinese public documents, but I think in this case, look at exactly what they say, right? I mean, it is very, very specific on what they want to do over the next 3 years. And I think that gives a really good sort of view on what to look for um, from now until 2027.
Oliver, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I mean, it was not only in the United States, I think across Latin America, and of course, most people haven't compared the Chinese document to previous documents and sort of, analyze this at this profound level as Leland has done. But it did, and that got a lot of attention in the Latin American media. It specifically denounces quote unquote hegemonism and unilateral bullying. Now, that may have been in the documents prior, but of course, in the Latin American reading, it was very much associated to the United States the John Rowe Doctrine. So, in a way, it came across as kind of a counterpoint, where a lot of people said, look, here's interventionist America. China wants to have this more cooperative approach. Even though, just one final point, I think there was a lot of attention also paid to this whole idea of digital ecosystem and all that, and that China is a permanent presence in Latin America. So I think it also amplified the debate that Latin America should do more than just run towards China in order to protect itself from US pressure, and that these are two superpowers, and that the way forward is probably that of diversification and seeking additional partners that go beyond Beijing and Washington.
So, Oliver, that's a great point, and it's one that raises a question that comes up time and time again. Both the Chinese government and analysts of China often say, oh, China doesn't really have a political agenda in Latin America. We can debate that. I have my doubts. But the question for all of you is, regardless of what Beijing's real or public intentions are, don't Latin American countries in their engagement with China clearly have a political agenda? And here, I think it's important to distinguish among Central American, South American, and Caribbean countries, but don't they really all have a political agenda in engaging China?
You want me to answer that one?
Yeah, please. I mean, I'd
Yeah.
love to hear from everybody, but yes, Oliver, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, I mean, these are highly political issues, and as Latin America thinks about its place in the world, all these are considerations that, it's not just a trade relationship. It does is intimately tied to issues like national security, like strategic autonomy, and I think that I always I just came back from the Munich Security Conference, and from a Latin American perspective, these the U.S. policymakers who say things like, "Oh, the Latin Americans and America, we're aligned. We're both concerned about China." It always creates this sort of weird gut reaction where, like, we don't think about China the way the United States does. It's just different. It's very far away. It's not seen as much of a threat. We utilize our ties to China to increase our wiggle room towards the United States. So this whole idea of gang up against China together with America is not intuitive at all in Latin America, of course. In addition to what Guo said, is that the Chinese want the Americans want the Chinese out of Shanghai. Well, what is in it for the Peruvians, right? Is this for somebody from Latin America who's seen the rail network in China and then takes the Amtrak. I take the Amtrak a lot. I'm between Washington and Boston, and it sort of is there's a perception that
makes you feel like you're in Peru, Oliver.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that what I'm thinking, like, we at some point would love to have a train between Rio and Sao Paulo, but in terms of the type of train, it should ideally be closer to the Chinese train than the Amtrak. Even though I think the Amtrak is fine, but it sort of comes to that point where the U.S. pressure against China oftentimes doesn't really say what really matters most to Latin Americans, is how do we get the support to, have better infrastructure, investment opportunities and all that. And many times there is no American company to substitute the Chinese provider, right? But evidently it's very, very political. Brazil, for example, certainly not a pro-American government, is not part of the BRI because it is seen as, shifting too much to one side. So this idea that China, very useful, diversification, very useful, but not moving too close to China, I think is very present. And I think
even with Brazil, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Please continue.
No, go ahead.
So Brazil's an interesting case to me because, of course, the trade relationship between China and Brazil is the largest in Latin America. China has more investment in Brazil, so it doesn't really look like there are that many limits. So I guess my question is, so you're saying there are Brazilians that say, we want to take advantage of what China has to offer, but we still sort of need to draw some boundaries around the relationship?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, do you think Lula actually thinks like, hey, we have to be careful not to become dependent on these guys? I mean,
yeah, the Latin American concern is about maintaining strategic autonomy and avoiding dependence on anyone. This is not just about America. Very clear notion of the potential risks that dependence on anyone, including China, would entail. And there's a lot of friction between Beijing and all Latin American countries with industrialized cheap goods coming in, threatening or ultimately destroying industries, about China imposing BRICS expansion, something Brazil was totally against, diluting the brand and limiting Brazil's influence. So a lot of issues there that I think that show that there's no, what do you call it? Pink, when you put on the rose tinted glasses, I think that's the
yeah.
you have that,
no illusions.
No illusions, absolutely. And also, I think, and this is heartening, no sort of populist anti-American. I mean, you have some of that rhetoric, but like if you talk to economic policymakers in Brazil, none of them say, I hate Trump. Let's rupture ties with the Americans. Very, very important. That in the same way that ties to China and Europe are useful to balance to retain some autonomy from the United States. Uh, Healthy, deep ties to America are important to manage ties with Beijing. And of course, then you have the whole sort of, which is still not gone, by the way. I mean, America currently, the brand suffers a bit for obvious reasons, but it's, you still have a credible demand from it's continuously the biggest market. You have tons of students from Brazil who want to study in the United States. I mean, there's still all that, which doesn't lead us to a situation where people like, let's run into the arms of China, run away from the United States. Definitely not.
Leland, I saw you raise your hand. Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, if I can just add a contrarian point here, I think that Brazil may be a unique case because Brazil's relationship with China is the most mature, right? In terms of all the other countries in the region. So therefore, I think Brazil has had more time to figure out how to manage both the positive aspects of economic engagement with China, with also being very clear-eyed about the potential dependencies. But unfortunately, I actually don't see that same finesse in certain other countries that have less time dealing with China. I do think that sometimes there is the rose-colored glasses on like, well, wait, China's only about economics in the region, and so
Yeah.
the concerns that say the U.S. or other countries are bringing up is seen as an exaggeration, or you're just playing, geopolitics, which obviously is all true, right? But I do think that there it needs to be, and I think there already is sort of an awakening. It's been 10 years, more than 10 years now of the BRI. I think more and more countries are realizing, okay, we need to recalibrate our economic relationship with China in order to make sure that there's not over dependency and that it doesn't expand into certain areas that may be difficult. Now, you have a specific story about this. Panama. I was just in Panama a couple of weeks ago, and of course, the Supreme Court decision was hanging around, the whole visit.
Just for our listeners, Leland, Supreme Court decision about what?
This was the Panamanian Supreme Court decision deciding about whether CK Hutchinson, the Chinese private company, whether it was constitutional or not for them to basically operate the two key ports around the Panama Canal, the Port of Cristobal and the Port of
And the
Malboa.
decision was,
The decision ultimately was that it is inconstitutional. And so therefore CK Hutchinson may be forced. Of course, they're disputing it in the courts, right? But if the decision stands, it does mean that CK Hutchinson will need to give up its operation of those two ports. But I bring this up just to say that the prevailing narrative that I kept on hearing on the ground from Panamanians in all facets of society was US, your president is the only president that is actually threatening to take over the Panama Canal, right? So why are you here talking about the potential national security concerns around Panama and stuff like that, all around China rather? All we see from our vantage point is the latest BYD fancy car, or our kids are on TikTok and whatnot. So there's nothing to see here. It's all good and positive. And so the narrative or the message that I try to convey is you can be critical of the US, and you should be. You can be very critical of this new, Monroe Doctrine, Dunroe Doctrine, but at the same time, you can also be skeptical of the increased economic and political and security relationship that China is trying to advance in the region as well. You can hold two things at the same time, and I think Oliver, as you mentioned, Guojie, as you mentioned, Latin American and Caribbean countries should be skeptical of any great power or over reliance on any great power, and should be able to maintain their strategic autonomy between the two.
So we're down to our last 3 minutes, and I want to invite each one of you, Guojie, Oliver, and Leland, to just make one final brief comment about what you expect for the future of China-Latin America relations. Guojie?
Well, I think we will still, go ahead to have this relationship. Of course, there are some difficulties because of the environment, but I personally, I think it will go well. Thank you.
Okay. Oliver?
So I think we're at this fascinating moment where there is a lot of signals pointing to some kind of truce. I think the Trump administration
Truce
does,
between whom?
however, truce between Beijing and the United States
Yeah.
now in the upcoming visit. At the same, and you do have some weird alignments. For example, Orban in Hungary being the candidate of Trump, Xi, and Putin. Very interesting. So very much aligned in their opposition vis-a-vis the European Union. It's in essence, it's an illiberal alliance. So in that sense, is a quite interesting convergence there. At the same time, significant potential for friction. I mean, just look at Peru. I'm quite surprised at how seriously the United States is pursuing the implementation of the Donroe Doctrine, which is clearly anti-China. So a lot of people, when they read the national security strategy, say like, "Oh, this is towards some kind of big understanding between Beijing and the United States." But Latin America, I mean, how is China going to react to that if the Peruvians actually kick out the Chinese from that port? I mean, there's $1.3 billion have been invested by the Chinese. So I think there's significant potential for friction, and coincidentally, it'll be occurring in Latin America.
Great. Leland, take us home.
One, you're going to see more multi-vector diplomacy on the part of Latin American and Caribbean countries. You're already seeing this in the form of Panama joining Mercosur, more or being a part of Mercosur. You're seeing more trade developments with EU and India, as Oliver mentioned. But you're going to see more hardball on the part of the U.S. That's typified by the recent U.S.-Argentina trade deal. When you read the fine print in it, there's something about space basically saying that Argentina needs to use U.S. technical assistance to protect its space facilities from undue influence. Very interesting. And then lastly, I think we're going to see more and more of China playing into the domestic political debate in Latin America and the Caribbean. That is exemplified by Honduras, which, of course, the current president now, Asfura, basically won, saying that he wants to switch diplomatic relations back to Taiwan because he didn't necessarily see a key economic benefit. So I think you're going to see more multi-vector diplomacy, more elbows and strong arms from the U.S., and more of a political importance of China in the region.
Great. Guojie, Oliver, Leland, thanks so much. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation, very timely, not something that is top of headlines, but clearly a very interesting, important dynamic. So many thanks to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully in Washington. Leland, let us know when you visit. Oliver, hopefully I'll see you around the neighborhood. And Guojie, please visit us soon. Thanks, everybody.